go. Hey, everyone. I'm Aish. Nice to be here. I work on GitHub Codespaces as I was introduced. But before I start talking about the main topic of the talk, let's just talk about the motivation, about the background. Why am I really here to talk about this? I've been in the tech industry for a while now, and I've been part of some high-growing teams at PagerDuty, Slack, and at GitHub at my current job. And I've been part of these teams as both as a senior engineer, as someone hired fresh out of college, as a staff, and as a principal engineer. And I've seen teams grow, projects fail, deadlines missed, projects having redone, all that mix of things. And a bunch of times, specifically arriving at the staff and the principal level, I've realized that it sort of happens because of somewhat of a dynamics or a philosophy or an organizational pattern that two principal engineers or more principal engineers differ on. And part of this talk was to start and come up with frameworks that we all can apply in our day-to-day so that we can work effectively sideways. This is not about managing your manager or mentoring the more newer folks on your team, but more about working with other principal engineers, other staff engineers in your organization, and sometimes crossing organizational boundaries in doing so. And when I made a job switch last year, I started taking notes, and this talk is effectively just a result of those notes. This is how this talk is structured. We'll first go over a case study, and I admitted this case study was not written by the OpenAI ChatGPT thing. This was 100% handcrafted by me based on mostly experience of a couple of people that I had mentored and myself. Then the second part of this will kind of talk about effective StaffPlus partnerships, how to effectively partner with other principal or staff engineers in your organization. And towards the end, we'll look at applying this at your workplace. So let's dive into the case study. So let's meet our character. Our character is a programmer named Bob. Bob is a freshly minted staff engineer at an enterprise SaaS company. The company's core product is a web application that is deployed on the cloud, and it's a monolith. Bob is a product engineer. Just to kind of distinguish, most enterprise SaaS companies have these two sort of distinction between a product engineering team and then like infrastructure things. Some of them also have these vertical chunks where teams do everything. But for now, let's just say Bob is a product engineer, does the front end, does the back end, helps their team, their engineering manager, product manager, shapes their team's direction, but mostly focused on the product. He's been at this job for, let's say, 3 years and has led projects big and small. And let's talk about his current project. His current project is to create an access control system. And again, this is an enterprise SaaS company. There are companies big and small using their product, and a bunch of times they have these access control requirements. Bob is confident about his understanding of the product. Bob goes on researching into this, comes up with the Google Zanzibar paper, reads up the paper, goes and talks to product manager, goes in and looks at competition, comes up with notes, and Bob finally decides that a role-based access control system is what he's going to be building. Before he starts building this system, he goes into the classic staff principal engineering route of writing a doc. We all love writing docs, don't we? Then goes in and shares it with his colleagues, other staff and principal engineers in the organization. Let's just go back. Okay. We'll talk about Carol in a second. After doing this, after sort of getting this informal feedback, Bob realizes that most of the folks in the company don't really want this new access control system to be in the monolith. The monolith was apparently getting old, and everybody wanted to do services for various different reasons. And there were these 50 teams in the company that wanted to use the thing that Bob needed to build. And suddenly, Bob was transformed from building a thing for the external customers to building something for the internal customers, his internal teams. Bob was now trying to decide whether to move on and go in and override his peers' decision about building this thing outside of the monolith or creating a service and training his 30-person engineering team to go in from building this classic product engineering route to having to figure out how do you deploy a service, how do you measure like its latencies, how do you set up the observability stack, how do you go on call for it, figuring out all of that stuff. Sadly, Bob did not really have an expertise on this, and neither did he want to take up on this big project of having to pivot the entire design. So now there was a dilemma. Do you really go in and follow what your other peer staff and principal engineers, the broader consensus says, or do you go in and just say that you have thought about this, you have done your homework, and autonomously make this decision? Now, let's talk about another character, Carol. Carol is a StaffPlus engineer who's an architect on the company's infrastructure team. Unlike Bob's team that work on the product and the monolith, Carol's team works on real-time services, caching, performance, all of the stuff which like I said earlier, are on the infrastructure side of the house. And unlike Bob, who's more of a tech lead archetype, Carol is more of an architect archetype. And if you haven't really heard about these StaffPlus archetypes or personas, let's just take a slight detour and talk about them. And we'll come back to the case study, and then we'll really go into the meat of the talk after that. Let's take a detour about archetypes. Will Larson, in his book, was probably the first person on the internet, at least that's what I happened to find out, again, using Google, not ChatGPT, that archetypes were like sort of, more publicized after Larson's posts and his book. And there were 4 of them, at least as per his posts and book. The classic one is the tech lead. This is what normally, like whenever people get to staff level, you sort of imagine them to be a tech lead of a team, supporting an EM, supporting a product manager, and coming up with a direction for that focused area. Often product engineering teams have this model. The next model is of the architect, like Carol in our story. Architect is responsible for the direction, the quality, and the approach within a big critical area. This is not necessarily tied to a product. Sometimes it is, other times it's not. The next one is slightly more open-ended. It's the solver. Solvers are usually folks who are sort of like sometimes parachuted from one type of teams to other types of teams. They help create and define the initial set of requirements, prototype things, kind of make it solidified, and then hand it over. They are more or less responsible for finding the right approach rather than the execution bits. Then there's the right hand, which is probably like the most open-ended of these 4 archetypes. And this is more like operating at the right hand of an executive, sort of borrowing their scope, so usually supporting like a VP or a senior director or a director, and setting up a bunch of cross-cutting organizational things. So these were the 4 archetypes. Bob is clearly one archetype, which is a tech lead, and Carol is more of an architect. So how did they work together? Back to the story. Bob happened to realize that he had a great contact within the company, Carol, and Bob and Carol were surprisingly part of the same onboarding batch at the company a few years ago, and they had sort of maintained this every quarter one-on-one. And Bob decided to meet Carol for this particular task. Turns out, Carol's org was facing another problem which is somewhat related. Carol's organization was trying to figure out how to get the access control data from the monolith and deploy it on the company's edge systems. Bob and Carol started to talk about aligning better. And there was clear alignment. Despite there being a huge organizational separation, Bob and Carol were aligned that their combined plan of action can be greater than the sum of its parts. And despite the team's expertise being clearly different, because there was this sort of top-down alignment from an engineering angle, they were able to combine their efforts and come up with a proposal that they ran by the company's architecture committee. Clearly, the project ended up working. They wrote a good blog post about the platform, they shipped the products, all that stuff. You might be asking, what happens next? Well, clearly, software does not really get done once you ship it, right? They also ended up working together in defining sharing ownership. How do we really share ownership? This is this complex role-based access control system that has bits in the monolith, bits in the edge cache, bits in the data pipeline. How do we really figure out who goes on call? Which VP do they really own it? How does the headcount of it really works? and like who really gets to really define the product or the engineering designs of this longer term. Luckily, there was a clear answer because Bob and Carol were aligned here. They ended up defining the clear boundaries. They ended up loaning people temporarily to each other's team, working with each other's managers, and making sure the entire organization, both the teams working on this particular product, were able to clearly go on call, understand bits of the system that were relevant to them. Let's do a recap of this quick case and then come back to the meat of the talk. As you really saw in the case study, two principal or staff engineers worked together to solve a problem and figured out that working together and having an aligned vision and sort of having that clear human-to-human contact and building that connection was the key in having this major, massive organizational win. Then now let's look at some of the frameworks, some of the different ways where one can achieve effective cross-organizational partnership. The first one is to create a shared vision and understanding of challenges. It's been talked about in this conference several times, so I might just be kind of repeating what a bunch of previous speakers said. So if that is repetitive, please bear with me. So the first thing is to create this shared organizational vision. How do you really do this? Specifically, let's say if you're a staff engineer on team A, there is 3 levels of, let's say, organization between you and the CTO, and then there's another staff engineer in organization B, there's 3 levels between you and the CTO, and then there's 3 levels of different OKRs between the two of you. What if your OKR and your peers' OKRs are completely different? How do you really define this shared vision of challenges? One way that I've experienced this in my career is operating in these sort of cross-functional groups. If your organization doesn't have one, this might be a good way to start a collaborative, cross-functional StaffPlus and pretty much open to any IC partnership. It might be a form of a working group. You might be starting a API working group that sort of looks over an API in a cross-functional way, rather than just setting up at a product engineering or an infrastructure engineering way. The other way is to have these OKRs be set in a way that also is more cross-cutting. So you might be able to work with another staff or principal engineer in other parts of the company and interpret and understand and plan an OKR in such a way that your projects are aligned and there is a shared technical vision for tech leads to execute on. And to kind of go back to our case study between Bob and Carol, there was clearly alignment between them because they had the shared understanding of the challenges. They were clearly on the same page that duplicating work was going to lead to fragmentation of effort. They could have gone in and built an access control system each, one that was clearly focused on the product and the other one that was clearly focused on the infrastructure. But the outcome of that would have likely meant that project timelines would have been much longer. So they ended up having the shared North Star where they knew that there was a bigger goal that was bigger than each of their team level goal, and they ended up shaping their work in that way. The next one is active knowledge sharing. Active knowledge sharing is effectively a way of saying, hey, if someone's sharing their document from their part of the company, it might not be super relevant to the things that you might be working on this quarter or the next quarter, but it doesn't really hurt to go in and read it, because you might really find nuggets where you might find some alignment between what you're trying to do and what they're trying to do. So try to participate in this. It might also be just you're attending some of their like prototyping workshops or something else that they might have set up, but being part of this knowledge sharing culture and starting one, more importantly, in your organization is quite valuable. Trust. It's been said quite frequently in the industry that software engineering is a team sport. It's not a thing where an individual can go in and simply build a thing. It requires a team to ship a thing. And often at times it requires many teams and principal engineers across those teams or across multiple teams and multiple organizations to have that trust. And building trust is really important. And how do you really go in and like build trust? It doesn't really happen overnight. Trust comes in from really having that key insight and that key empathy that we are all trying to achieve the same thing. It might be using different means and methods, but the understanding that we are all trying to achieve a similar shared goal helps in building trust. And supporting and empowering others is another key thing which you can do to help create trust. Offering help and guidance and resources whenever others need. You can sow the seeds of trust by sharing your expertise, feedback, and insights with each other, and by acknowledging and appreciating each other's contributions and perspectives. Communicating openly and frequently, sharing your goals, your challenges, feedback, and expectation helps in creating mutual trust. The next part is saying no with tact and empathy. Can I get a show of hands if you have been part of a technical review committee or sort of like a group where you have said no to an architecture or a design plan? Wow, okay, that's like 70%. Great, wonderful. I love being on the team no, because, thank you, yeah. Because it's usually easy to start with a no and then eventually get to a yes. If you're just a stamp head saying yes to every single decision, you might as well be, again, replaced by a bot. Not that they're taking away our jobs, at least not anytime soon. So how do you say no with tact and empathy? How do you really say no as a human being? There are a couple of approaches that I've had to use in the past, and which I thought I might share in this conference. The first one is provide well-reasoned explanations for dissent. Oftentimes, this comes in through clear communication, actively listen to others' viewpoint, and seek common ground. Remember the story between Bob and Carol? Bob originally started building the system, or proposed building the system inside the monolith. And clearly, he got a no from his peers and ended up pivoting an entire design. Had it, again, going back to the story, had he clearly built the system inside the monolith, maybe the outcome would have been that it clearly would not have survived the scale that the system was required to operate in. So in order to say no, start with trust and empathy, and provide well-reasoned explanation for dissent, and actively listen to others' viewpoint and seek common ground. Now let's sort of move on from more of the abstract stuff, the more like from the case studies and a bunch of stuff around that, to applying this thing in your workplace. How can you just like, take this talk and apply it tomorrow at your work? The first thing is finding a StaffPlus community. We've talked a lot about working effectively with peers in other parts of the company, forming these relationships, the benefit of them. But how do you find a community? How do you find a StaffPlus community? Well, we're all in a conference called the StaffPlus conference, so this might be a good place to make some connections. And then there's also more. There's also more places where you can kind of go in and meet new people and start sort of building your StaffPlus network and your community. One example is you could go ahead and do it online. RLS, Rand's Leadership Slack, a former VP under whom I operated at the Slack, Michael Lopp, sort of runs this thing. You can Google this. There's a ton of great resources there. There's a staff principal engineering channel, architecture channel, and a bunch of channels where there's a global StaffPlus community where folks ask questions about design patterns, about everything from setting a North Star direction to also like having a monthly donut with someone random on the internet and hearing about their stories. And sometimes, at least to me, I've had those conversations become recurring. I've had folks that I have met online that are other principal or staff engineers in companies in other parts of the world that I talk to every quarter or so just to kind of bounce ideas off of them and understand their challenges and share mine. So this might be a good resource. There's also the lead dev community that I think is behind the back of our badges that you can join in. There's an online Slack community that you can join in. In addition to that, your workplace might also have employee resource groups or other communities that you can join in. And those might be really good ways to meet other folks with whom you might be able to strike up a conversation and eventually take that relationship to eventually, getting around and breaking those organizational barriers. Set up one-on-ones with people that you think are interesting, that people you think that have given you good feedback, and like Bob and Carol in the story where they were just part of the same onboarding group, they ended up having to work together. This is, again, a thing that might materialize for you all. Industry events, we just talked about this. Say hi to folks around you, go learn about what they do. And aside from just like meeting other principal or staff engineers, that's just the intro part. In order to kind of build up on that, ask for help when you need. Bob was trying to clearly get feedback from his peers, and rather than even going through a formal design review, Bob ended up just like pinging a couple people on Slack or Teams and then getting some feedback. So ask for help when you need. Show interest. When others ask for help, show interest. Find common ground. If you're trying to say no, find common ground. If you're trying to coach, mentor, or just help out other folks, try to understand the problem and seek common ground. And again, to repeat myself, deal with empathy, and that'll go a long way. Just to recap what we just talked about, we talked about a few examples of building trust, shaping a technical roadmap, breaking down organizational barriers, and meeting and building up on the trust that you kind of have with peers, as well as some key insights from the case study that you can hopefully go home and apply to your day-to-day work. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you so much. I'll be outside if you have any questions.